We've been looking again in the book of Genesis, and we have covered the four major events. As we know, the book of Genesis has 50 chapters. It is the first book in the Bible. It is a book whose name means beginnings, and it deals with and talks about the beginning of things. And we know that it's divided strategically from chapters 1 through 11, dealing with four major events, and then chapters 12 through 50 dealing with four major persons. And we told you that just because there are major events does not mean that there are not significant persons involved. And just because there are major persons does not mean that there are significant events involved. But when we talk about Genesis 1 through 11, or the emphasis is on the various events that occur. And although there are key persons there, the events are much more significant by way of studying what happens in those 11 chapters. And so in those 11 chapters, we found out that the four events have to do with the creation, covered in chapters 1, and then covered more microscopically, if you will, in chapter number 2. And then we found out that the second major event is the fall. We've discovered that in the fourth chapter in the second chapter, or third chapter, I'm sorry, of the book of Genesis, the fall. And then we discover the emergence of the flood that really begins to manifest in the sixth chapter of the book of Genesis, the sixth chapter through chapter number 9. And then, of course, we get to chapter 10. It's a table of families, because God has already said to to Noah, that I'm going to reestablish the earth through you and your three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and their wives, that they're going to produce and reproduce upon the earth, and they're going to repopulate the earth. Because remember, under the flood was an event that encompass the entirety of the earth. And what we need to understand about these four major events is that we're talking about events that are global in nature. When we talk about creation, that's global in nature. It's dealing with the entirety of the earth. We talk about the creation of man. We talk about the generation of man. It's man throughout the earth. When we talk about the fall of man, it's the entirety of the human condition. When we talk about the flood is an event that covers the entire earth, chapter 6 through chapter 9 of Genesis. And then when we talk about the Tower of Babel, we talk about the entirety of the earth. Remember, at Babel, the earth is one language, and everybody is speaking the same language. And in doing so, it displays something in their heart, unity of the worst kind. Unity that really results in an effort by humankind to make their way to God in their own using their own mechanisms. And so that's where we kind of left off in regard to the fourth event, which is the tower and the separation of the languages and the various cultures. And so we found there in chapter 11, where we were looking at where we were wrapping some things up regarding the fourth major event. Remember, the creation, the fall, the flood, and then the Tower of Babel. And the Tower of Babel, the critical thing there is it leads to the dispersal of languages, the changing of language, the confounding of languages, and it leads to people being dispersed throughout the earth. Now, a part of that is to fulfill the will and the purpose of God. Because remember that the instruction that's given to Moses and to his sons is to go and spread out across the earth. At the Tower of Babel, they tried to stay there and not be scattered, not be spread out across the earth, which would be an act of disobedience to the command and the directive of God. But more significantly is their effort to build a tower that reaches unto God. This is a display of the religiosity of humanity that seeks its own way to God without following the way that God has provided. Remember, when Adam and Eve fell, that one of the biggest issues with regard to their fall was their efforts to cover themselves. You remember they took fig leaves in an effort to cover themselves in chapter number 3 of the book of Genesis. This is the foundation of human religion. And yet we see it manifesting after the flood in situation at the Tower of Babel. Look again in chapter number 11 as we will move through that so that we can get into the life of Abraham. But in chapter 11, verse 1, it says, the whole earth was one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelled there. And they said one to another in verse number 3, go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly, that and they had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar. And they said, they said, go to, let us build a city and a tower. Watch what they're saying now. Let us build a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name. Let us make us a name. And listen to the last part of that in verse number 4, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the earth. And then verse 5 tells you the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men built. And the Lord said in verse 6, behold, the people are one, and they have all one language, and said, and this they began to do, and nothing shall be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. And then God says, let us go down and let us confound their languages, that there would be confusion among them, that they would not understand each other, so that they would be indeed scattered to go about the earth just as God had instructed them to do. But this was their effort to build into heaven, if you will, and to establish their own name. And we have to be very careful when we begin to talk about building our own name and leaving God out of the picture. Verse 8 tells us the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of the earth, and they left off to build the city. So there was a cessation or a stopping of the building of the city, a stopping of the building of the tower, because of the scattering, the confusion of the languages, so that there was a spilling out into the various cultures and the various divisions and separations in the earth. And the Shemites went one direction, if you will. The Hamites went another direction, and the Japhites went yet another direction, because there was dispersal of languages. And now there's a lot that can be said about that, and we did some teaching on it last week. We told you some key things about that. How that God observed human pride. We talked about how God's decision to confuse the language, the scattering of the people, and that the very name, the Tower of Babel, the name means confusion. The name means confusion, and that the Tower of Babel was a symbol of human pride. It was a symbol of human pride. And Proverbs 16 and 8 lets us know, or 16 and 18, Proverbs 16 and 18 lets us know pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. And so we see, let us make us a name. We see the indication of a prideful manipulation and prideful moving forward, that God came and caused there to be a confusion of the language, so that the people would be dispersed. And so we have to bear in mind those 4 events. Why are the events significant? Because they are global events. They are global events. Now, what we're going to discover is that as we begin to attack the next part of this, that we're going to begin to deal with the reality that God, where at the beginning of Genesis, the focus is on the entire earth, that now as we begin to navigate, the focus is going to be upon a narrow, if you will, space of land, and going to be upon a particular a particular set of people, and that is the Shemites, if you will, coming of the heritage of Abraham. So that God's going to deal with a particular family in order to build a particular nation, so that he can minister to the rest of the world through this family. So that God begins to deal, whereas in the earlier chapters 1 through 11, God is dealing with the the macrocosm, the big picture. Now God's going to deal with the microcosm, the small picture, working with the nation of Abraham and dealing with Abraham and moving forward in that particular way. And we understand then something about this movement as well, is we begin to understand that the Bible begins to deal with various journeys, and I want us to think about that as we begin to move forward into talking about the family of Abraham, and talking about actually the entirety of the entirety of the rest of the Old Testament. So we can even begin to talk about that, because now the rest of the Old Testament is going to deal with Abraham and the Abrahamic heritage. It's no longer, if you will, dealing with all of creation and every element of creation, but it is a focus. That doesn't mean that God has deserted and left the rest of humanity, but the scriptures now focus on a particular individual and that individual's family that God calls out, and uses that family as a template to show to the rest of the world God's dealings with humanity. Now, throughout the Old Testament, Israel, the Abrahamic nation that comes forth, is going to interact with the other nations of the world. They'll interact with places like Persia. They'll interact with various other parts of the world, and I will talk about that a little bit. But the focus is going to be on the Abrahamic heritage, and the Abrahamic heritage in relationship with Babylon, the Abrahamic heritage in relationship to Egypt, the Abrahamic heritage in relationship to Syria and Assyria, and in relationship to the various nations that are the nations of the Old Testament. But again, the focus is going to be on Abraham, on the Abrahamic family. Now, I want to give to you, and I want to say to you something that we can work through as we're dealing with the bigger picture now. And then we'll deal with Abraham. First of all, I want us to understand that the Old Testament deals with 6 journeys, beginning with the life of Abraham. Deals with 6 journeys. That's why we call the Bible a book of journey. We call the Old Testament a book of journey. We call the Bible a book of journey, because even when you look at Jesus, just when his earthly ministry is launched, he begins journey. He begins to go from one area to another, all in the area of Palestine in the case of Jesus, but he moves from one city to another. He moves from one province to another, the province of Galilee, the various provinces and the cities throughout Palestine. But in the Old Testament, it is also a book of journey. It is a book of journey, and there are 6 major journeys that we study the Old Testament in. That we focus on those journeys, we begin to understand what is going on. Because as you move to begin to look at chapters 12 through the rest of the Old Testament, the question always becomes, where is Israel journey, or what part of the journey are they on? Which of these 6 journeys? Now let's make it very simple. So Abraham, when God calls him, and we're going to touch on that again tonight, when God calls him, he calls him to take a journey. We call that journey number one. That's the journey of the Lord that caused Abraham in the land of Ur to go into the land of Canaan. That's journey number one. Abraham, get out of your father's house in the land of Ur. That's you are Ur, not Oz, but the land of Ur, and go into the land that I'm going to show you. And the land that he's going to show him is a land of Canaan. And the journey from the land of Ur to the land of Canaan is a journey of about 1,000 miles. That's the first journey. The first journey for Abraham, and the first journey, if you will. They're not a nation at this time, but the first journey of the family of Abraham, the first major journey, because people are always traveling from one place to the other. But the major journeys of the Bible, from which you can study how the Bible comes together and how it comes to part in the Old Testament by looking at what journey is involved. So the first journey that we deal with is the journey of Abraham from the land of Ur to the land of Canaan. We're going to come back and we're going to look at that tonight. The second journey is the journey of Jacob and his family to Egypt. So Abraham comes into the land of Canaan. He develops his family there. There are like four major locations that he circulates in relationship to the area of Canaan: Shechem, Haram, and there are others that we'll mention in a moment. But in the first journey, the first major journey, he's coming from the land of Ur in the area of Mesopotamia, area that is highly developed, an area that had way back centuries ago had indoor plumbing and other kinds of systems in place. And God calls him to come out of Mesopotamia, the land of Ur, and to come into the land of Canaan. In other words, to come from a place of high development, to come from a place where there are structures for living indoors, and to go into a land that he does not know, a journey of 1,000 miles away, and to come into that land and to pitch a tent. To pitch a tent. Now, why would God do such a thing? Well, one of the reasons is because the land of Mesopotamia was a place of pantheism. And now we learn something about the issues of theology, or theism, if you will. So that pantheism is belief that God is that what makes up God is the sun, the moon, and the stars. That the earth or the atmosphere or something in the atmosphere is actually God. That's a pantheistic belief. The second thing that we learn about Mesopotamia is that it was a place of polytheism. And polytheism just deals with the word poly, mean many, belief in many gods or many systems of God. So we have this pantheistic belief and this belief in many different forms of God. And also there is a belief system that was that one may refer to as deism. Deism, the belief in a God that is non-personal. The belief in a God that is non-personal. A God that you cannot have personal relationship with, a God who is not a loving and merciful God, because it's a non-personal God, an object God, if you will. And that's a deistic belief system that there is a God that does not engage in the affairs of humankind. All right. So these were some of the belief systems that were there in the land of Mesopotamia, and from which God calls Abraham. Now, I hesitate a little bit because you're going to see that the initial call is actually to Abraham's father. His name is Terah. We're going to look at that 11th chapter. We're going to see that was the initial call was to Terah to get out of Mesopotamia. And he begins to move, but he stops, and he doesn't go all the distance. And because he doesn't go all the distance, the Bible says Terah died. And then God spoke to Abraham and told Abraham to get out. Now, there is a suggestion that can be made that because Terah did not do all of what God called him to do, that is the reason that he died at the point that he died. If God can't get you to do it, then he'll raise up somebody else to do it. Now we'll look at that a little bit closer. So the first journey is Abraham from Ur to Mesopotamia. The second journey is, of course, from Canaan into Egypt, and that's under the family of Jacob. When Jacob and his 12 sons, in Joseph is a prince in Egypt, and we're going to touch on those things. Joseph is a prince in Egypt. There's a famine, and what begins to happen is Jacob family, 70 of them. That's how big that number had become at that time. 70 of them end up in the land of Egypt under the administration of Joseph, who is the prime minister, who is in charge of the resources, and who is a blessing to his family. And so that's the first journey, that's the second journey from Canaan to Egypt. Now the third journey is the one that should be easy for us to think about, and that third journey is from Egypt to Canaan. Egypt back to Canaan, because the Exodus brings them out of Egypt once they have suffered and become slaves and they've gone through persecution. God sends Moses, and that third journey occurs to bring them out of Egypt and take them to the land of Canaan. And ultimately, it is Joseph that brings them in the land, but that is the third journey, coming out of Egypt, the Exodus, going back into the land of Canaan. And then this is where it gets very, very interesting, because after that, for many, many years, they are in the land of Canaan, and God establishes a kingdom. In fact, first there are a confederacy of judges and what have you, of champions, but then God begins to establish them as a kingdom, and raises up kings that will serve over them. And first there is the United Kingdom of Israel, which the first king over that United Kingdom of Israel is the King Saul. And Saul was the people's choice. It wasn't God's choice, but the people demanded and begged for Saul, and God allowed him to be king. And Saul was a miserable failure ultimately. But he serves for 40 years, and the Lord raises up David to be king over all of Israel. And David not only is king over united Israel, but he's king over all of Israel. He expands their territory. He raises up a mighty army, and he raises up the standards of righteousness. Then there is the third king of the United Kingdom, and that is the king Solomon. That is the King Solomon. So they only, as United Kingdom, they only had three kings of the United Kingdom, and that's Saul, David, and Solomon. Now you read about this in the book of First and Second Samuel, First and Second Chronicles, and in First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles. Those 6 books of the Bible: First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles. You read about the history and the development of the kingdom of Israel. And so that third king was Solomon. And that period constitutes about 120 years. 40 years of the reign of Saul, 40 years of the reign of David, and then 40 years of the reign of Solomon. Well, after Solomon, the kingdom is split. And now you have the north and the southern kingdom. So the next 2 journeys are dealing with the breakup of the nation. Now let's get it right. The first 3 journeys deal with the coming together of the nation. The first journey being Abraham coming from Ur to go into the land of Canaan that God's going to give to his people. The second journey is Jacob going into the land of Egypt under the administration of Joseph, and they become slaves in Egypt after many, many years. So that's the second journey from Canaan into Egypt. The third journey then is the Exodus from Egypt, when God brings them out with a mighty deliverance and brings them into the land of promise, ultimately under Moses' successor, if you will. Moses journeys with the people for many, many years. We'll talk about his life. And then God appoints Joshua as his successor. and Joshua brings the people into the land. And so once the people are in the land under Joshua, they remain in the land for a significant period of time. They have wars and what have you, but they remain in the land. And then the emergence of the kingdom and Saul, David, and Solomon, and then the kingdom is divided. And the kingdom is divided because of various acts of disobedience, because of bad decisions being made by the son of Solomon, whose name is Rehoboam. Rehoboam decides to annihilate or get rid of or disregard the leaders that had served under his father Solomon, and as a result, the nation becomes split, and a man by the name of Jeroboam. So you got Rehoboam and Jeroboam. A man by the name of Jeroboam becomes instrumental in splitting the nation. And so what happens is that under Jeroboam, the 10 tribes go with Jeroboam, and 2 tribes remain with Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. The nations that remain with Rehoboam is called the southern kingdom, and the kingdom that goes with Jeroboam is called the northern kingdom. So the J kingdom is the northern kingdom, and the A kingdom, if you will, is or I should say the R kingdom is the southern kingdom. Now, what happened? Why are we talking about this? We're talking about this to talk about these journeys. So now we saw the first 3 journeys are dealing with the building of the nation and the coming together of the nation. The next journey has to do with the breakup of the nation. So journey 4 and 5 deals with the breakup of the nation. So the journey number 4 is from Canaan, or the northern kingdom, if you will, being driven into the land of captivity. So it's talking about Assyrian captivity. The 4th journey is the northern kingdom being driven into Assyrian captivity, coming out of their Canaan land into Assyrian captivity. There are 2 captivities. One is Assyria, the next one is Babylon. That's why I call it A captivity and B captivity. So A captivity is the first one, Assyria. They're driven into Assyria, the northern kingdom. And then the surviving kingdom, called the southern kingdom or the Davidic kingdom, is driven into Babylonian captivity. And when you hear about Babylon, you think about people like Daniel. You think about the Hebrew boys. They were some of the young people that were taken into captivity in the land of Babylon. So we see that those 2 journeys, the 4th and the 5th journey, deal with the breakup of the nation. Journey 1 through 3 deals with the coming together of the nation. Journeys 4 and 5 deals with the breakup of the nation. And the nation breaks up in 2 parts, the northern kingdom and then the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom goes into Assyrian captivity and are driven out of the land. And then the southern kingdom goes into Babylonian captivity and are driven out of the land and are dispersed. Now, the southern kingdom is called back together, but the northern kingdom is dispersed because of their intense wickedness. They're driven into captivity first because of their intense wickedness. But don't stop there. The southern kingdom displays wickedness also, but it is preserved because God made promise that the Davidic kingdom will be preserved because it is the kingdom through which Messiah will come. And so the final journey is the return to Canaan. The return to Canaan is based upon the promise made under the prophetic utterance of Jeremiah, where God gives Jeremiah instruction to tell the southern kingdom that yes, judgment is coming and you're going to be overthrown. And the nation under Nebuchadnezzar and others are going to overthrow the southern kingdom, and you're going to be driven out of the land. And when you get there, build houses. Don't expect that this is going to be an overnight event. I'm going to restore you, but it's going to take time. It's going to be a period of 70 years. He says it's going to be 70 years before you're able to come back into the land. and they are dispersed, just as Jeremiah prophesied. Now, when we get to the book of Jeremiah, we'll begin to see how there were others that were prophesying during Jeremiah's time who were saying that Jeremiah was a lying prophet. It's not going to happen that way. It's just not going to happen. Micaiah, I believe it is, was one of the prophets that began to speak words to say that Jeremiah is not speaking the truth. It's not the word of the Lord in his mouth. And yet the Lord stood by the word of Jeremiah, and it came to pass just as Jeremiah had prophesied. And they were driven into Babylonian captivity. And thank God that Jeremiah also prophesied that God would cause there to be a return. And after 70 years, they began to return back into the land. Well, that begins to occur under leaders like Ezra and others in the scriptures that we'll get to that began to reestablish them in the land. Nehemiah. That's where the book of Nehemiah comes in. That's where the book of Ezra comes in. It is all during this period that relates to the southern kingdom being restored back into the land. And there are a couple of journeys that are made into the land. There are some activity that are done where it shows their faithfulness. And then there is also yet some rebellion that occurs. And there's still the judgment of God that is being manifested. Now, that's an overview of the journeys that relate to the old, that relate to how we look at this Old Testament. So I wanted to give you an expanded panoramic view of the kinds of things and the kinds of journeys that occurred. And so that as we move forward, one of the things that's going to happen is I'm going to be making reference to those particular journeys. I'm going to be making reference to what period we are dealing with as we go now and begin to talk about Abraham. Remember that the rest of the Old Testament is dealing with Abraham and his family. And that becomes the nation that is called Israel. Now, while the nation of Israel is the focus, we understand a critical reason why it is the focus. It is the focus because God calls unto Abraham to make known unto him that the Lord your God is one God. And this is the critical thing about the calling of Abraham and the building of the nation that would be called Israel, is that God is using them to be a rejection of all of the other doctrinal or theological outlook on the world, to stand out as a beacon that says the Lord your God is one God. There is no polytheistic notion, multiple gods. God is not the sun, the moon, or the stars. There's no pantheism. God is not a deistic God who is not involved in the affairs of humankind, who is disassociated, but that he is a theistic God. That's the doctrine of theism. The theistic God, that he is alive, he is a God who is active and involved in the affairs of humanity, and that he is one God. And then, of course, in the life of Moses, we began to see that play out even stronger when God begins to give instruction that began to say, to tell the people, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shall you serve. Then you begin to see on the life of Joshua, where he begins to tell them in Joshua 24 that choose this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. So the most critical part of this is to understand that God, yes, is building a nation. Yes, he's going to use Abraham. He gives him supernaturally a son in his old age, gives Sarah a son when she is 90 years old, and so on and so forth. And all of those are powerful things. God makes Abraham wealthy, and he gives him all kinds of opportunities. But the biggest part of this is the understanding that God's will and desire was to promote one God, knowing that the Lord your God, he is one God. The split of the nation under the administration of after the administration of Solomon is related to the fact that that Israel had began going after other gods. All of the instruction that God would give to them about not marrying other nations was not because other cultures were not as good as they were. It was because I don't want you to intermingle with other gods, with other claims of deity, because that is an affront to me, God is saying. Know the Lord your God is a jealous God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Don't even make any graven images unto me. And we're going to be dealing with the Shema. We're going to be dealing with the law and the instruction about the Ten Commandments as identified in Exodus. I believe it's 19 or so. We'll get into to all of that to the glory of God. Now, uh, what we'll talk about as we go along is also the various enemies or adversaries, major adversaries that Israel will have throughout their journey in the Old Testament. So names like places like Egypt will come up, places like Babylon will come up, places like Assyria. So I already named three of them. There are five major ones. That is Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, Persia, and Syria. Syria, Persia, Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt. Those, as we go throughout the Old Testament, we began to see uh, these various powers or various nations in power at different times. So that Israel, God is building a nation, and sometimes the leaders in the world, if you will, are opposed to Israel, and there are different leaders at different times. So that when one nation overthrows another nation, then that becomes that particular leader in the world, and Israel has to deal with that particular nation. When at one period of time, of course, Egypt was the world power, and Israel had to deal with and interact with Egypt. At another time, Syria becomes the world power. Israel has to deal with Syria. Persia is world power. Israel has to deal with Persia, Babylon, and Assyria. And we'll be addressing that as we go along. When we talk about these six major journeys, we talk about the five major world powers that interact with Israel. And those five major world powers, again, you already know some of them. Okay, just kind of get used to it. Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and Syria. And we'll address that as we go along. Now let's return to the to the 11th chapter of the book of Genesis, so that we set a little bit of a platform so that we can see here in this 11th chapter what begins to occur. And I told you in an earlier place how important the name Peleg was, and so on and so forth. But let's just read down a little bit further here in this chapter, where it says, verse number 16. Let's read there. It says, "And Eber lived 430 years and begat Peleg." And that name Eber, many believe that that's where the word Hebrew comes from. So Eber is a critical person in the lineage that will lead up to the Abrahamic family. And as is Alfraxis, which is in verse 13. But we don't have time to get into those kind of things because that's not the aim of this kind of study. And so as we look down, then we see, trying to move forward here, we see that, and Peleg, verse 19, lived after he begot Reu, R-E-U, 209 years, and begot sons and daughters. And Reu lived 32 years and begot Serug, S-E-R-U-G. And Reu lived after he begot Serug 207 years and begot sons and daughters. And Serug lived 30 years and begot Nahor. Nahor, very important, critical person. Let's watch what happens with Nahor. Look at verse 24. And Nahor lived 29 years and begot Terah at 29 years old. Terah, then, of course, is the father of Abraham. Let's read further down. And Nahor lived after he begot Terah 119 years, and begot sons and daughters. And Terah lived 70 years. Now look at his age, 70 years, and he begot Abraham, Nahor, and Haram. Now you see Nahor again. This is the this is the grandson of Nahor that is mentioned at the beginning. So and so you see that Nahor begot Terah, and then Terah begot three children that he named one of them after his father. Everybody, I hope everybody's seeing that. And then now we get into the Abrahamic story. This is still chapter 11, but the primary purpose or the primary aim of chapter 11 is dealing with the Tower of Babel. But in order to get to chapter number 12, we have to see the seeds of what is happening regarding Abraham. So we see in verse 26 again, and Terah lived 70 years, and who are his children? Abram, Nahor, and Haram. Abram, Nahor, and Haram. And these are the generations of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haram begot Lot. Now, Lot's going to come up in Genesis because Lot is the nephew of Abraham. And listen, look at verse 28. And Haram died before his father, Terah. So let's look again. Terah had three sons. His sons were Abraham, Nahor, and Haram. Haram had a son by the name of Lot. Haram died early, and he died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity in Ur of the Chaldees. So that's where Haram died, in the land of Ur of the Chaldees. Before there's any movement taking place, he dies while they're still there in the land of Ur in Mesopotamia. Verse 29, Abraham and Nahor took them wives, or Abram and Nahor, because his name is not Abraham yet. This is his birth name of Abram. God's going to make him the father of many nations, but this is his name now. So Abram and Nahor are the named children that Terah still has, because his third son has already died. And so at verse 29, and Abram and Nahor took them wives, and Abram, and the name of Abram's wife was Sarai. This first mention of Sarai, we call her Sarah because her name eventually becomes Sarah, but here it is Sarai. And this Sarai name is an aggressive name. It means it means to rise upon. It suggests someone that is not under authority. But we have to deal with that in another setting. And the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, and the daughter of Haram, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscar. Now, there's a lot being said there. Let's move on. But Sarah was barren. She had no child. So early off, even before there is a movement out of the land, early here in these events that are occurring, the thing that we see, even before God calls Terah, before God calls Abraham or Abram, the big issue that we begin to see here is the barrenness of Sarai. That seems to be an issue that is standing out here. Let's look at verse number 31. And Terah, watch this, took Abram his son, and Lot, the son of Haram, his son's son. So he took his grandson Lot, Abram's nephew, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur to the Chaldees, to go into the land of Canaan, and they came unto Haram and dwelt there. So every suggestion here is that that God somehow began, even though it doesn't say it specifically here, that Terah got the word that he was to get out of Ur and go into the land of Haram, and go into the land of Canaan. You see it there in verse 31. And yet they came to Haram and dwelt there. They came to roughly the halfway point and dwelt there. And listen to what it says. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haram. He died in Haram. He died in the place where he stopped. He was on his way to Canaan, but he stopped. They dwelt there. Now, if the Bible had said that they stopped there, for a moment because they had to reset so that they could get on a journey. No, they were on their way to Canaan, but they stopped in Haram, and the Bible says he died there. So we have to understand that the call seemed to have been to Terah first to go to Canaan, and yet he did not fulfill that call, and so God moved on. And look at we're in chapter number 12 now, very quickly. In chapter 12, we see in verse 1, now the Lord said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. I notice that Terah seemed to be having this thing right, but he stopped, and God took him off the scene, and then speaks to Abram and says, get out of your father's house. Get away from his kindred. Why is this language so strong? And a critical part of why and how this language is so strong is, again, that issue of monotheism, the belief in the one true and living God. And listen to what God begins to say to him in verse number 2. I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. Notice again, as God is calling him here, and at verse number 4, notice a critical thing. And Abraham departed, watch verse 4, 12 and 4. And Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him, and Abraham was 75 years old when he departed out of Haram. So he leaves out of Haram. Now, we call it the journey from Ur to Canaan. That's because he started the journey under his father's administration. But then he finishes the journey after his father dies in the land where they dwell. It never should have dwelt there because the direction was to go into the land of Canaan. And in verse 5, it says that Abram took Sarai, his wife, Lot, his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gathered in Haram, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. It shows their arrival there in verse number 5. And then it begins to talk about one of the places that Abraham travels. I want you to see, he talks about him traveling in Shechem there in verse number number in verse number 5. And you move forward, you see in verse number 8 that he arrives at the mount of east of Bethel, and he pitches his tent there in Bethel. And there he built an altar unto the Lord. So you begin to see the first manifestation of a worship act on behalf of Abraham in the land of Canaan in verse number 8, where he builds an altar unto the Lord, unto the name of the Lord. And he journeyed in verse number 9, going on still towards the south. And then look at what begins to happen in verse number 10. There was a famine in the land. And so now we see Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous on the land. So we don't call that a major journey, but now he's out of the land going down to Egypt for the purpose of dealing with the issues related to a famine. So let me just give us some things concerning the life of Abraham. Because I know that we have to move on and we don't have a whole lot of time. But let's understand here that the first major move once he is in the land, once Abram and his wife are in the land of Canaan, is the reality of a famine. And that famine leads them to journey up to Egypt for the purpose of being able to survive a famine that is great on the land. Now, we know that by the time that Genesis ends up, the household of Abraham's dead by that time, but the household of Abraham is going to end up in Egypt again because of a famine. So famine becomes a critical thing that gives us a lens to look at the book of Genesis. And we need to understand something. We need to understand that that remember I told you about the world power of the region, if you will, of the area during this particular time is Egypt. So that Israel is not even a nation at this time. It's just a family of Abraham. And so when there was something going on in the various regions of the world surrounding the area, Egypt, if you will, Africa, is the place that element of Africa that is called Egypt is the place that they go for purposes of survival. It's where they go for purposes of survival. And I want you to see something that begins to happen here because Abram develops a bit of a bad habit that is going to be repeated in later chapters here in this chapter number 12. Notice here, and it came to pass in verse 14 that when Abram was come to Egypt, the Egyptians beheld the woman she was very fair. Talking about Sarah, she's 65 years old, but they looked at her and said, "Man, she's a good-looking woman." And the princes also of Pharaoh saw her and commanded her before Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And he entreated Abram well for her sake. He treated Abraham well. Abraham got treated well because of his wife. And he had sheep, ox, and his asses, and manservants and maidservants, and she asses and camels. So uh, uh, this guy was wealthy, and he blessed Abraham, but he's doing it partially because of Sarah. And watch verse 17. Because see, when you had a call of God on you, you got to be very careful with how you manage stuff. Verse 17, and the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. Now, Abram called, and Pharaoh called Abram and said, "Who is this that what is this that thou have done to me? Why didst thou tell me she was thy wife?" See? So Abram and Sarai is dealing with this thing, and even though he's called by God, they have an ongoing agreement to deceive that God is going to have to deliver him from. And so they tell Pharaoh that she's my sister. And it's what some people call a white lie, but it's still a lie. And verse 19, why saidst thou she's my sister, so I might have taken her to be my wife? Now therefore, behold, thy wife, take her and go thy way. And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away and his wife and all that he had. So that basically what you see happening here is that the first move that they make away from the land, they're covering the reality of who Abraham really is, and as a result of that, God brings a plague on Egypt. Remember, Egypt is the place that they've come to because there's a famine in the land. Now, Egypt is dealing with a plague because of the Abrahamic situation. If you look at chapter number 13 very quickly, it says, Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all that they had, and Lot with them into the south. And Abraham, now watch this already in verse 2. And Abraham was what? Very rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold. Even in famine, even when there was a plague, even though he had to go down to Egypt, God made Abram rich in cattle, silver, and gold. On every dimension that one could think about being wealthy, God made him wealthy. And he went on his journey from the south, again coming back north to Bethel, and unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Hai, Hai. Now notice that after this fiasco in Egypt, he comes back to the place of worship. Bethel is called the house of bread, or the place of worship. He comes back to the place of worship. And look at verse 4, unto the altar which he had made at the first. And there Abraham did what? Let's look at it, verse 4. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. He called upon the name of the Lord. You know, sometimes you got to go through some stuff to get you back on your square. But he gets back to Bethel and back to the altar that he built. and called on the name of the Lord. And Lot also with Abram had flock and herds and tents. So we see the blessing of God on other people that were around him just because they were associated with them. Okay, now there is only so much. Man, my plan was to cover all four of these patriarchs, but we're not going to be able to do that because our time is away. Well, let me say just a few more things about Abraham in the little bit of few moments that you'll give me. We understand that Abraham went through a number of tests. We began to talk about that a little bit tonight. We see God's call in Genesis 11 and then carrying into Genesis number 12, verses 1 through 3. And we see the test of obedience that God gives Abraham. That's really what he's challenged with is a test of obedience. And then we see we already covered this at point 2. We see Abraham and Sarah in Egypt, and we look at the consequences and the things and the events that happened there in Egypt. We've already been talking about this. Then we see Abraham, which we did not get to today, but I want to point it out because we have to move on past that. Abraham and Lot has to separate. That's in chapter number 13 as well. Now I want us to understand something that the life of Abraham as recorded in the scriptures is covered in Genesis 12 verse 1 through chapter 25 and verse 18. So there are several chapters that deal with the life of Abraham. And these are the early chapters. But in that 13th chapter, we begin to see that because of the blessings of God on Abraham, that Lot also begins to experience blessing. And we see in that 13th chapter that there is a struggle between the herdsmen of Lot and the herdsmen of Abraham. And we see the decision being made that Abraham says, listen, don't let there be any strife. Look wherever you want to, take whatever land you want to, Lot, and I'll go in the other direction so that there will be no strife. And we know that Lot looked, and he looked in the area that looked like an oasis, and he took the choice land, but that the Bible says there in that 13th chapter, but that land looked towards Sodom and Gomorrah. And so that ultimately we're going to see that there was a problem there that began to happen because he ends up in Sodom and ends up in a situation where God brings judgment to Sodom, and the angels have to escort Lot and his wife out of the land of Sodom. So all that begins to happen in the 13th chapter. By the time we get to the 14th chapter, we see Abraham dealing with a test of. We begin to see him dealing with a strange scenario that is an interface into the life of Abraham. And in that 14th chapter is the chapter that first deals with the issue of alliances, so that there are kings that are they're referred to as valley kings that began to conglomerate and to go to war against each other. And one of those wars was towards Sodom, and Abraham's nephew Lot was there in Sodom. And Abraham, when he saw these wars coming together, Abraham went out and gathered together those that were with him and did war against the kings in the valley. And he was able to free Sodom and to free Lot from the control of the kings that he fought against. And he was able to take the spoils and the goods of those kings based upon the God being with them and the warfare that he was able to fight. That's chapter 14. Critical in that chapter is Abraham meets Melchizedek in the Valley of the Kings. At the war of the alliances of kings, Abraham meets Melchizedek, which the Bible tells us later is a type of Christ. He when he meets Melchizedek, he has bread and wine, suggesting communion, togetherness, community. and he pays his tithe. This is the first mention of tithing. We already know that the first evidence of giving had to do with Cain and Abel when they were called in the fourth chapter or the third chapter of the book of Genesis, and third and fourth chapter, they were called to come before the Lord and bring an offering. Well, here we find in chapter 14 the first mention of a tithing, where Abraham pays tithe to Melchizedek.